My pleasure to welcome our guests now this evening who will be in conversation with each other. Before I welcome them up, I just want to give a moment to introduce them properly, beginning with Mary Ping, who's a New York-based designer with an art background from Vassar College. In 2001, she launched her eponymous collection, and her conceptual line Slow and Steady Wins the Race followed in 2002. She's a United States Artist Award recipient, winner of the 2017 Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian National Design Award in Fashion Design, the Eco Domani Award, and the UPS Future of Fashion. Her work is part of the permanent collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Museum at FIT in New York, the RISD Museum, D'Este Foundation in Greece, and the Fondation d'Argentprise Galerie Lafayette in Paris. And she'll be in conversation with Mellissa Huber, a fashion historian specializing in 20th century dress. She is associate curator in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she's contributed to multiple exhibitions and co-curated the shows Women Dressing Women from 2023, and In Pursuit of Fashion, the Sandy Schreier collection from 2019. She received her BFA from the Fashion Institute of Technology with a minor in art history and a certificate in curating fashion from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She holds an MA in visual culture from New York University, where she is adjunct faculty in the Costume Studies graduate program. So please, without further delay, welcome Mary Ping and Mellissa Huber.
Thank you for sticking around after all of that. Our talk will not be scary, and it's going to be the opposite, nerdy. Just to give some context on how we got roped in is a lot of mutual friends, and that's how it came to be, which is very nice. The genesis on my end was I have a pre-existing relationship with Inventory Press, friends who are great graphic designers and publishers of the Us book screenplay, in addition to all the other previous Jordan Peele screenplays. And then coincidentally, decades back, just friends, Ian Cooper and Rachel Foulon, who are now part of Monkey Paw Productions. So when this book came about, Shannon and Adam from Inventory Press, they knew I'd been sort of like starting to work on uniforms in Los Angeles, and they said, hey, we're working on contributors to the book, you're doing uniforms, we need a costume commentary, can you write something? So, and that's how I am here now. And then I got to hang out with Mellissa.
Thanks, Mary. And similarly, I have colleagues at Monkey Paw who are great friends. As Tyler mentioned in the introduction, I am a fashion curator working at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I'm often working with what we might characterize as high fashion, thinking about garments that are exceptional in terms of their artistry or technical innovation, or objects that have really strong conceptual underpinnings to them or are very reflective of the zeitgeist of a certain moment in time. And correspondingly, when I'm asked to comment on costume and film, which is not my specialty, usually people want to talk about things like Downton Abbey or the Gilded Age. So it was a really sort of interesting and fascinating invitation to be asked to talk about this very multi-layered, multifaceted, fascinating film in which costume plays a really important role. And I would also say that I do see a lot of parallels between costume design for film and high fashion, particularly when it comes to the really performative aspects of it, where often you see garments on the runway that are really serving to convey an idea, perhaps, and that in reality might not even be produced or are produced in very different iterations from what we see and what's documented in the press. So it's sort of fascinating to think about how those different types of garments serve to message different ideas in across creative mediums. So yeah, I'm very grateful to Inventory Press, to Lincoln Center, and Monkey Paw for this invitation, and of course to Mary. Mary and I had a chance to talk a little bit about what the focus of our analysis would be for this talk, and in the spirit of uncovering cosmologies and all of these connections, we thought we'd just go through the references that we've seen in the costume design, but perhaps we could start thinking about the more quotidian aspects of dress.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I was just focused on when I had to write the piece for the book. It was, my assignment was, specifically from Inventory Press uniforms. But then, just a disclaimer, I hate horror films, and especially anything with home invasion. So when I was like, is there any way I can write something without watching, repeat moments? But I'm actually, really glad that you brought that topic up because, and I think this is why Jordan Peele is a very thoughtful director and talented director, because he's giving consideration to these details. And I always am fascinated by everyday quotidian dress and this sort of connecting theme, especially in horror films, because it's this contemporary day. It's supposed to kind of like set up this very false sense of security, because both families that are terrorized in the film, they have these like sort of almost like generic blank upper middle class aspirational wardrobe, meaning Adelaide is wearing this like white linen shirt dress. You first see Winston Duke in like a polo and chinos, and everything's very American catalog of a certain social class, if you want to say. And then same with like their friends at the beach, they are kind of stereotypes of, the wife drinking rosé. She's wearing a pink caftan that matches her sunglasses. So everything's supposed to be this what can go wrong kind of moment. And so it did make me kind of like think back to like, okay, well, what are they wearing outside of the obvious tethered costumes that all of a sudden you're confronted with, in the walkway of the house, backlit, parts of, the red showing. There's hints of it as you brought up on the beach when the son first sees this figure, but hidden under a dirty trench coat. So these are all very intentional moments. And I just want to quickly add, the costume designer is Kim Barrett, who also, I think for most people, famously is the costume designer for The Matrix. So I thought it was an interesting choice that, she came on board for this film. So I always find fascinating in like horror films, it's the safe wardrobe. And then all of a sudden you do have this, contrast, obviously, with the red uniform. And we'll just start calling it that. I mean, we're going to switch this terminology every now and then. This, boiler suit, unitard. And I would say that's where Mellissa has a lot of insight too as well. Yeah.
Well, I think that, as you brought up, this sort of duality is a through line across the entire movie, and we see that in so many different ways, whether it's looking at the time on a clock, 11:11, or the duality of the family and their doppelgängers. And I think that the red uniform that we see the Tethered's wearing is a really great example of that duality and how truly complex it can be too. There's so much paradox that can be unpacked from the uniforms themselves. And I've thought a lot about what these uniforms are and also what they are not in this specific context. As you mentioned, it's interesting because the first time that we really catch a glimpse of the uniform is with the man on the beach, and the son, Jason, runs into him and he's terrified, and we really only catch a glimpse of it. It's just sort of protruding outside the edges of a large trench coat. We see a little blood on his hand. But the first time that the uniforms are fully revealed is when the family appears in the driveway, and all of them are standing together, hands linked, which mirrors the Hands Across America campaign, which we see introduced in the start of the film. It also mirrors something that we see in the very end of the film, those red paper dolls, which Red is cutting out in the sort of underworld. So that's sort of an interesting tie-in to these broader ideas, but uniforms are often made to be really functional, and I think that there's sort of a duality to them in themselves, right? So there is this very pragmatic, functional aspect to them when we see them in like military use or for professional occupations. They're often providing warmth or providing camouflage or serving in some way to hold tools or things. Another important like flip side to uniforms, though, is this conceptual or ideological bent to them, right? And that is about signaling group affinity. It's about, in this instance, not only creating the connection between the family, but it's also signifying that break or that disconnect between the tethered and the real family, in fact. And if we start to look at them in detail, we can see that they don't have a lot of incredibly functional elements to them, right? They're like boiler suits, essentially. We don't see large, oversized patch pockets or cargo pockets. There aren't even belt loops to hang weapons or tools or whatever one might imagine. There also, interestingly, isn't any sort of magical or sort of superhero function to them, which is something that I think we often see in like horror and fantasy genre too. They're really quite straightforward when you think about them. And it's interesting to, unpack those details of the uniform itself. What we really have is this very bright, eye-catching uniform, which is quite distinctive and really stands out on the film. I think that you've read a little bit about some of the techniques that went into actually creating like the patina or the hue of the cloth itself.
Yeah, well, just more like the choice of the red specifically. So there's a great article that The Atlantic ran with Kim Barrett and a conversation with her meetings with Jordan Peele. And so obviously they wanted to use the color red, but it was a specific, they decided it was going to be an in-between red that represented wet blood and dry blood, as if it was an old wound. And I thought, okay, so that's an additional potent layer, and that you had read that in order to achieve that, you really did have to dye it of various like ombre testing. And what I like about knowing that sort of back information is just from like a manufacturing and fabrication point of view. It's like, oh, here's a costume designer that went out and did the custom dyeing versus like sourcing just like a on the stock, red canvas, which they could have easily done as just like a sort of like a workwear to kind of represent like the workwear, unitard. And but I do think that the choice of, when I was watching the film the first time, like the choice of the uniform that kind of stuck with me. And then when I sat down to write the essay, was like, oh, wow, you kind of can't avoid the similarity with like a prison uniform because, there's like the bright color, which is meant to kind of like attract your attention, even though you're erasing the individual. And then we were talking earlier how, they're sort of individuality is removed because they're all wearing the same thing. But in a way, it's like more, it's just more intimidating when you have 4 people wearing the same thing, and so that in itself is another, I think like in very important wardrobe choice for like the storytelling here. And then you actually noticed something with like the cropping of the lengths, and that I think that's like another important decision in the design.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, and I wanted to go back to a point that you brought up, though, about the uniforms sort of erasing individuality, because when you see them on the family, too, it's something that works really well for both genders, for all ages, so it really becomes this unifying aspect in that sense. But thinking about the cut and the fit and the way that it works on the body, even though it is sort of unifying in that sense. It's interesting because another reference that plays into the uniforms that the Tethereds wear, which comes up in the very start of the film, actually, is Michael Jackson's Thriller, which we see in one of the opening scenes. And I actually just rewatched the Thriller video, which I hadn't seen in a very long time, and I've had the song in my head ever since. But it's really worth a contemporary watch for those that haven't seen it in recent years. When it was created, Michael Jackson had commissioned John Landis, who had directed An American Werewolf in London, and it was, I think, the most expensive and highly produced music video of its time when it was introduced in 1983, and it was really created as a way to help promote this album a couple years, actually, after it had initially been released. But John's wife, Deborah Newleman Landis, created the costumes for Thriller, and she talks a lot about this red leather jacket that Michael Jackson wears and these matching monochromatic red pants, and she introduced them as a way to lengthen the body, really, and make Michael Jackson appear like taller and more powerful and present, which is really fascinating to think about, because the costume designer for this film actually talks quite a bit about how she really intentionally cropped the trousers and the sleeves, so you could really see sort of the bones and the skin and the body beneath these uniforms, which I think is a really interesting contrast to think about. And incidentally, Jordan Peele has talked a lot about Michael Jackson and his influence, and there's a lot of duality there too if you think about this sort of paradox of a pop star who's also a villain in this really popular music video that's sort of relevant to the film as well. We also see things like the single glove that the Tethereds wear too, the leather glove, which is really interesting. And I know that Michael Jackson has spoken a lot about this idea of the single glove being a way to be distinctive. He wore it initially to cover up a skin condition, but he decided that it was so much more powerful to have one glove as opposed to a matching set because it was a little bit off, a little bit unusual. And I think about that when it comes to some of the costume choices in this film, whether it's the sort of cropped hems on the garments themselves, even some of the makeup details. We haven't really talked about this, but I read somewhere that one of the actresses had suggested that the Tethered's eyebrows be disappeared by makeup, which, you know, something that's so similar but has that slight uncanny difference is something that can be really sort of unsettling.
Yeah, it's because it's an expectation you have of something that's, again, like the everyday, and then you just remove one element and you have the sensation that it is off. And I think that's why with like uniforms, it's I personally find fascinating because we kind of take for granted this idea of like, oh, this is something I have to wear for a certain job. And then historically, if you sit down and really, which is what I did, like I had to like kind of like, you know, put out the pieces where I'm like, okay, well, doctors have a lab coat, and those look like a certain way. And there was a study done where residents, half of the residents were given a lab coat to see how they would perform, and then the other half were, wearing just like their hoodies and t-shirts. And the ones that were wearing lab coats automatically felt like, oh, they were already a doctor, and they performed better in their residency. And so you have like this sort of important role that the uniforms give a person, but then it's like supposed to be egalitarian, but you ultimately still have roles. You still have within an industry, you have chef de cuisine, but then you also have the sous chef. They're both wearing uniforms, but they have to be distinctive to denote the hierarchy. And you have it in different, other sorts of industries as well. And then here, I think there's the sort of idea of it being egalitarian, but it's very also menacing. It's used as like a menacing tool in us. So we had a lot to talk about with that. So
Absolutely. And, to go back to that point of uniforms and jumpsuits more specifically, the jumpsuit being seen as this like egalitarian garment. I know you wrote about this a little bit in your essay for the book, but outside of jobs, some of the first introductions that we see are major advocates for this idea of sort of a quotidian uniform that can be worn by the everyday man were often advanced by like artists, for example. You write about Ernesto Michaelis or Tayat, a palindrome, which is a nice connection to the doubling that happens in this film.
Yeah.
We also have people like constructivist artists like Varvara Stepanova, who are thinking about today's uniform. And a lot of these uniforms were really like emblematic of ideas related to progress. When we think about the jumpsuit and some of their early uses on planes, planes represented travel and progress and sort of access. So, as we brought up, there's also this sort of equalizing that they're intended to symbolize. I know we've talked about other examples like the Mao suit, for example, in China, which is another really interesting example of that.
Yeah, it still falls into always these progressive utopian movements where when inevitably like the group of people, they always think about like, well, how are we going to unite ourselves? And so the Mao suit is probably the most famous in terms of it being so like systemically adopted for so long, and it's supposed to be like anti-gender because you had male and female wore the same exact thing. It was always pants and this sort of military influenced jacket because Mao wore it, and it's everyone had the same color, same cut, and with the hat, and so you become this like monolith again, and the individuals erased because you're supposed to be part of this collective group, and I always think like the sort of like backfiring of that is when people still ultimately have the desire to kind of like break through and show some sort of customization. I'm just thinking more specifically when people do have to wear like a school uniform. You always see like this sort of like renegade, like I'm going to try to make it a little bit different. I'm going to try to make it my own. And then so with obviously we don't have the Mao suit now anymore, but it's incredible that like for these like utopian ideology. It's always like, oh, you have to wear the same thing, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's a good example, too, of a uniform that functions more in the ideological sphere as opposed to like the pragmatic sphere, too. Actually, the number of pockets on the Mao suit had distinctive meanings and emblematized sort of like different attributes or value systems. The number of buttons and different parts symbolized different areas of respective areas of the government. So there's a lot of intention and meaning behind all of those small details to unpack, which is sort of fascinating and brings me back again to thinking about like religious uniforms, which are definitely, you know, I guess they have some paradox there because in some respects they are about being egalitarian, especially for like women religious, for example, where it's about sort of presenting a tabula rasa or like a homogeneous front. But they also similarly often serve to denote rank and distinction and hierarchy. And a really important color within the Catholic Church, for example, is red, coming back again to this really potent, prominent color, which has, even within the church, and I think certainly within this film, connections to the corporeal and to blood specifically, and the blood of Christ, the blood of the victims in the film.
Well, we got the 5-minute signal. So we were talking about how we would just kind of wrap it up with like, also just finding all the Easter eggs as like reviewing and, you know, like, yes, that's a plug to rewatch the film as many times as you want. And, but yeah, you know, having kind of like, I felt like I was doing homework in terms of like, oh, I should really like rewatch this to be, you know, more prepared and like feel like we can give you some helpful information. But I noticed so many more things too that you kind of do take for granted when you're watching it the first time because you're kind of involved with the plot, or you're distracted by all the jump cuts and the scares and the adrenaline moving. But I tend to rewatch things that I like over and over again, and I always pick up. I think for a very well-crafted film, you always do pick up like the sort of like second meaning and third meaning, and like, oh, there's a reason why that's there. You know, it's not because they had to make a, you know, quick fix or something. So, and I think that's you will get that in this film.
Absolutely. And to end on the note of red, which I was just thinking about, I have to say, similar to you, Mary, going through and watching the film again, but watching it with the companion script, which is something that I've actually never done before, was a really fascinating exercise for me. And I was thinking about, as I was going through and able to sort of like look at different references or see if I missed something or get the specificity that maybe being terrified makes you lose focus for a moment. I was looking at language a lot also, and I kept going back to this idea of tethered, which is a word that comes up over and over and over in the film. But within that word within that larger word, we see the color red exists as well, which is also, again, the name of Adelaide's doppelganger. So, I think that the film merits another watch, even beyond this, and hopefully you'll all take a different look at it after our talk today and this screening as well. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your Sunday evening time.